Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History 11. The title of this lecture is European Slavery, the Beginnings of British and American Slavery. So, as you can see from the title of this lecture, we're going to talk just in brief about British and American slavery and the overall tenets of the European slave trade. Of course, your book that you should be relying on will have quite a bit of interesting things to say about slavery, and it'll give you a good overview of slavery and the nuances. And what I'm going to try to do is try to focus in on key on some aspects of European slavery that you kind of need to pay attention to as you move through your assignments and you're looking at European and British slavery, and they'll have some carry over into our discussions about slavery and social death, about the history of world slavery, and also about antebellum slavery, as we'll see later on. Of course, for our purposes in a U.S. history class, British slavery would be the antecedent to American slavery or antebellum slavery. So they sort of go hand in hand because British people, obviously the founding fathers, they were British and then later they'd become Americans. So those lectures all sort of weave together in some real important ways. And of course, what we're going to do here is appreciate the beginnings of British slavery, and that'll take us into the 17th century. Now, just mind you, with that, I just probably need to say here that there is some connection between racial philosophy and the justifications for slavery inherently built in with racial philosophy. So if you can kind of tie in those particular aspects together, you'll really be able to understand this in its full amplitude. And of course, there are some nuances and differences between world slavery and British slavery. British slavery or American slavery probably has more in common with, let's say, Roman slavery than it does, let's say, with slavery that was practiced in the Pacific Northwest or slavery that was practiced in Africa per se. So from that standpoint, let's go ahead and start looking at, and we'll go over some things that we had already previously talked about in our lectures, but we can start looking at Europeans and their quest for wealth and how mercantilism was tied into this quest for wealth, and how that, of course, spurred people like the Portuguese, like Prince Henry the Navigator, to go out and search for new markets and new territory. So with the Portuguese, with Prince Henry, we saw they were looking for new markets, new trading partners, new colonies, and also a route to the Indies. And as we stated earlier, the earlier maps had some depictions of new territory, particularly places like Africa. And this territory essentially was really unknown. And of course, when we talked about Prince Henry, we talked about the idea that Prince Henry wanted to know the extent of the world, know the extent of Muslim power, and this quest to locate Prester John. And so really Africa is the key here to really understanding how African slavery would become part of the Europeans' quest for wealth, and eventually how that would be transplanted over into North America. So Prince Henry and the Portuguese established trading centers all along the coast of Africa, beginning in 1434 all the way to 1445. Now, essentially, what's going to happen is that Europeans bring with them, the Portuguese bring with them goods to Africa to trade, things like ivory, spices, and what they're really looking for are things that would make them inherently wealthy, like bullion or gold. The first expeditions by the Portuguese were seen by Europeans as simply folly. There were things that were being brought back, sure, like ivory and other things that were being brought back that you could really, in all practicality, um, could be assessed as helping to make people wealthy. But it wasn't until the first handful of slaves and gold dust that was brought back by the Portuguese did the Europeans, particularly the English, really stand up and pay attention. But the key to all of this is to understand that Portuguese are going to establish these trading posts along the coast of Africa, and eventually they will get involved heavily with the African slave trade. Now, I just need to say a couple of things because you'll always hear people say things like, well, Africans sold their own people into slavery. Well, now you have the conception that everybody in the world practiced slavery. Slavery in Africa was not the same slavery that was practiced in Europe. Typically in Africa, when a person was brought into slavery, and this could have been done typically through conquest or by not being able to pay off debts or to some thing that happens, um, uh, um, for example, through maybe committing a crime. Generally speaking, those individuals who were part of the slave system were considered to have rights within the society, and they were considered to be part of the families that the slave owner. So, for example, you might have an individual who's working in the house as a slave. They would have been, for all practical purposes, been treated no different than anybody else in the family. This is European slavery will be fundamentally different than it will be practiced within Africa. So, quite generally, Africans who did sell or trade slaves with Europeans had no idea that European slavery would be practiced very differently than the slavery that would be practiced in Africa. The other thing is that the number of people that were actually traded for slaves by African kingdoms was extremely minimal. Most of the slaves that were taken by the Portuguese and the Spanish and the English were taken by force, the vast majority of them. So while you do have some people who will make the argument, well, you know what, you can't blame Europeans for African slavery because some Africans actually traded slaves. Yes, that did happen, but it was such a minute portion of the overall slave trade that it just really boils down to the fact that most of the Africans that were being captured or taken into slavery were being taken in through capture. Right? So that's the important distinction that must be made here. But really, Portugal, once it brings slaves and gold dust back to Europe, then Europeans begin to recognize that the best way to get slaves is to get them in Africa. For one, Africans generally were not Christians, and so the laws that prohibited Christians from being slaves could not apply to Africans, since inherently they were either practiced their indigenous African religion or they were Muslim, Saracens. The Spanish imposition into slavery really begins around 1501, where Queen Isabella is going to authorize slavery for Spain. As the territories in the New World are opening up and being conquered by the Europeans, the Spaniards, and the Portuguese, they recognized really quickly that they could begin planting things like sugar plants and other crops, but those crops needed to be harvested. The first general consensus is that the local Indian population could be enslaved. And that's exactly what happened in Mesoamerica. The slaves were the Native Americans were captured the Aztecs and other groups, and they were enslaved. And that's going to happen also in the southwestern part of the United States, and also through California and through the Pacific Northwest, right? The indigenous populations are forced into slavery, but within the Caribbean, most of the native populations were completely decimated by the Spaniards, and so there were no essentially Native Americans left. Lots of Native Americans from those islands were, if they weren't killed, they were shipped off to North America and sold into slavery in the British colonies or the French colonies. So right off the bat, for the Spaniards and Portuguese, there were problems with labor, particularly on those islands, the Caribbean islands. And so they needed to have some viable labor force. Where the English are going to rely on indentured servants, there is no such program for the Portuguese and for the Spanish. So they're going to have to rely on a other labor source, and what they do is they turn towards slavery. Again, beginning with Queen Isabella in Spain in 1501, and of course in 1508 and 1511 with Ferdinand V and Charles V taking slaves from the Guinea coast to Portuguese territory. The English are going to get involved in the slave trade, and largely prior to 1619. However, we use 1619 as a sort of catch-all date for the beginnings of the introduction of Africans into the Americas. Now, let me just say this. There were people of African descent in the Americas long before 1619. There were people of African descent with the conquistadors, right? They were conquistadors and they helped conquer those Mesoamerican populations. So then why the date 1619? A really odd occurrence happened during that year. And what happened is that a Dutch ship was sailing off the coast of Jamestown, captained by a man named Jope, Captain Jope. And this ship docked, and the captain informed the British settlement at Jamestown that they had actually ran out of food. And what they had to trade for food were 20 African slaves. So the British exchanged food for these African slaves. They were immediately Christianized and they were placed in servitude, not slavery, but indentured servitude. And so these 20 Africans were now Christians, and so therefore they could not serve as slaves, and therefore they were put in indentured servitude, and they were actually, after a number of years, freed. One of them, a man named Anthony Johnson, he took the name Anthony, the Christian name Anthony Johnson, would later go on to own a large farm himself and even own slaves himself. So from that standpoint, we use this one incident as the demarcation or the beginning point for discussing or talking about British slavery in North America. It is a completely somewhat random and arbitrary event and date that we choose, but it nevertheless helps us to kind of begin to have a starting point to talk about the imposition of slavery into British North America. And so here is a sketch that was made of this one particular act. Now, slavery will become part of the British colony, and particularly Jamestown, by 1638, with the first public auction of about 23 slaves. The price of these slaves were about 27 pounds or $27. If you think about how much that is, think about an average English laborer earned less than $1 per day, about 70 cents. So when you factor in, if you made, let's say, if there's 30 days in a month, you made $30 and you take out rent, food, and all the other incidentals, you would have to save a few months in order to be able to purchase a slave. Um, Virginia and other colonies will begin to adopt rules for slavery. Some of them we'll talk about in a moment. But the thing to focus on here is that some of these rules are being adopted for the maintenance of slavery and the regulation and running of slavery are borrowed from the Romans, particularly this whole concept of slaves as property. So we see around 1650 why slavery would be important to the colonies is simply because tobacco is the main staple, the cash crop. Farmers are planting tobacco everywhere, even in the streets of Jamestown. You couldn't in some streets you couldn't even ride down the street in a cart because there was so much tobacco being planted everywhere. It was the colony's largest cash crop and responsible for beginning of slavery in the British colonies. Planters in the beginning had little interest in slave labor. What they were primarily focused in on was indentured servitude as the preferred source of labor. And the reason for that is because in the beginning there was plenty of land for freedom dues. They knew the population. It was a system that worked quid quo. The planters would get much needed labor. The indentured servants would get land. But as more indentured servants came in and land was less available, the planters began to realize that they needed an alternative source of labor. So it eventually became necessary to switch from indentured servitude over to slave labor. Now, in terms of race relations within the colonies, blacks and whites worked side by side and stood as equal. So if you were a free black person and a free white person, you had the same rights according to the British law. It's not going to be until many years later that people who are not white within the British Empire would begin to recognize that that there is not the same equality that exists within the British Empire based on race. But this wasn't the fact early on as the British Empire began to expand. Racism became part of the British Empire's hegemonic force as a clearer understanding of racial philosophy and the ideology of racial philosophy began to get infused within the world's understanding of its populations and the British ideology. So, but early on, before that ideology could be supplanted in the minds of Europeans, blacks and whites stood as fundamentally equals. And I'll just give you just a quick anecdote to this. George III, who is the King of England at the time of the American Revolution, is married to a black woman, right? So at the particular time when early on, racism takes its time to get folded into the psyche of Europeans, and this is not something that happens right away. It takes time for it to sort of manifest itself in the consciousness of people in the world as these theories of racial philosophy are written and incorporated in the education of Europeans. So here, blacks and whites are equally punished. All indentured servants are indentured servants. One of the other things that's important here, and we saw this with those 20 Africans that were brought in to Jamestown, is that Europeans did not enslave Christians or Englishmen. People didn't see themselves as being white or black or what have you. They saw themselves as being Christian or non-Christian, or they saw themselves as being Englishmen or Frenchmen or German, etc. again, if we use the anecdote going back to George III, who was King of England at the time of Revolution, even though George III is the King of England, his family is actually German and not English. So people identified themselves, right, as German or English, etc., and not so much as race. Again, this doesn't, that portion of the ideology or consciousness doesn't come until later. So people identify as part of the nobility, part of the gentry, artisans, servants, and what have you. Now, we can take a look at the colony of Virginia that can kind of give us a sort of understanding that slavery doesn't happen just all at once, nor do the laws affecting slavery were they enacted all at once. There was a slow transformation of the colonies towards using slave labor, right? And this is a subtle but slow process that happens one law at a time, one regulation at a time, and it will differ from colony to colony. Massachusetts will enact its own slave laws. Virginia will enact its own slave laws. Georgia will have its own, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no one uniform policy of or laws of slavery affecting the colonies. It's different based upon the colonies itself and their particular needs and issues. So by 1662 in Virginia, blacks could be held for life in slavery. 1667, baptism no longer brings freedom for blacks. So if you, before, as we saw in 1619, if you were Christianized, you couldn't be held as a slave. By 1667 in the colony of Virginia, that's not the case anymore. If you are baptized after 1667, you could still be held as a slave. 1670, they forbade blacks and Native Americans to actually own Christian servants. So you could have Christianized a slave, taken them to a slave market, and blacks and Native Americans would have been forbidden to actually own or buy that person. The status of the mother was determined by the status of the or the status of the child was determined by the status of the mother, right? And that goes again to this whole concept of property, which we'll get into a little bit more when we look at slavery and social death. 1705, all black, mulatto, and Native American slaves are real estate. Now, I just kind of need to just run over this really quickly. Just because you were a black person in the colonies doesn't mean that you were a slave. Slave is a status or condition, right? So you have to have been a slave in order to be affected by the law. So a free black person in the colonies would not have been affected. As a matter of fact, there were free black people who did own slaves, free Native Americans who owned black people and Native American slaves, right? You would have had white people who owned Native Americans and black slaves. Now, I should just also add this. There are some people who've made the argument that there were white people who were slaves and they were essentially indentured servants, and that's not true. Indentured servitude is not slavery. Once indentured servitude ends, you get your freedom. Slavery, by 1662, you are serving for life. The only way a slave could be freed is through a legal process that we call a manumission, right? With a indentured servant, your contract has a start date and an end date, and once that end date comes, there is no legal or requirement or nothing that you have to do. You just, once that date hits, you're done with your time in servitude. So there was no such thing in the United States as white slavery. So we can see from this, by 1705, Virginia will make slavery essentially permanent. So we get the end of indentured servitude, which is really going to spur on this quest for slavery. And of course, as I stated before, land becomes less available. England has a massive reduction in its population, meaning that there's lots of work to do. Um, Work is plentiful. Um, there is essentially no need for the English poor to come over to the New World for opportunity when famine and the Great Fire of London have made available plenty of work within England. So people have heard about the stories and they've been, saw the letters that came home from indentured servants in British North America that it was essentially indentured servitude was just something that you didn't want to do, that it could either be a moderately okay form of labor or it could be hell. It all just depended upon the master, the person that held your contract, and how they treated you. So, from that particular standpoint, you can see here how indentured servitude would essentially dry up and there would be a need for some other form of labor. One of the more important events that would have an impact on British labor is Queen Anne's War from 1702 to 1713. And this war was fought over the uh, Spanish throne, who would eventually get the Spanish throne. And so this largely spilled over into fighting into British North America, as most of the wars in Europe and during this time period were spilled over from Europe into North America. This particular war, Queen Anne's War, was fought over the Spanish throne. And the settlement of the Spanish throne was done by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the war, which gave the Spanish throne to Philip the Fifth, who was the grandson of the French king Louis the 14th. Britain, in return, will receive Gibraltar and Minorca and something even more valuable called the Asiento. The Asiento essentially was a document. And this document basically said that whoever bears this document has the sole right to import slaves over into Spanish North America. England got a hold of this document in exchange for letting Philip V become the king of Spain, and they held on to this document essentially for 30 years. With this document, the English would import well over 6 million slaves into British North America. Now, I'm just going to say this really quickly about the numbers. We have somewhat of an idea about how many Africans were transported over into North America from Africa. Some of the records we have are good, and some of the records are no good. So we've done really some good statistical modeling to try to hammer down and to figure out exactly what the numbers are. And they swing from about 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 million people were brought over from Africa to North America. No telling how many of those slaves didn't survive the journey, but usually that's the numbers swing from about 20, 25, 30, 40 million people that were brought over. Probably the greatest transfer of human people from one particular location to the next. The Asiento allowed England's share to be about 8 to 10 million slaves. Now, what Queen Anne does with this Asiento is that they sell this to the South Sea Company for about 7.5 million pounds, which back then was an ungodly number. So, what this does is that it makes slavery a private enterprise and not a government enterprise. So, what's going to happen with European slavery is that it's going to transform the North American continent that had some groups like Native Americans who had societies that had slaves into the North American continent as a slave society. And with this transformation, particularly of British North America into certain, at least certain aspects or parts of British North America into slave society, race gets interjected into the institutionalization of slavery. So while you have these racial philosophies being sort of made to support the importation of Africans, racism and the ideologies of these racial philosophies are being intertwined and intermingled into the slave trade. So by this time, what we end up getting is this sort of weird concept that the term Negro, which was the term that was used for black people, being extrapolated and converted into slave. So to think of a slave is to think of a black person. So even in today when you think of slaves, even though for the word slave comes from the Slavic region, no one thinks of white people as slaves. They always think of black people as slaves. And that has been one of the sort of the fundamental sort of tragedies with slavery, is that it becomes tied to and linked to a race of people. Now, there are regional variations of slavery. In New England, you have a society with slaves. The middle colonies, Pennsylvania and New York, essentially some slaves, but so few slaves that it can just be accounted as these two particular colonies as really not having any sort of institution of slavery. The Chesapeake colonies, the Mid-Atlantic colonies, Virginia and Maryland, is a slave society. And then South Carolina and North Carolina and Georgia will be slave societies. Now, this is going to have demonstrative effects on the colonial economy. Sugar, tobacco, indigo, rice, these are going to be the principal crops that will require slave labor in the colonial economies. And also, these products will be transferred over back to Europe and traded for manufactured goods in Africa, or these goods being transferred back into the Americas. So if you can imagine sort of the Atlantic Ocean, where you have manufactured goods coming out of England, some of them going down into Africa to be traded for slaves or to be used for the capture of slaves, manufactured goods being sent over to North America. Out of North America, you have things like lumber, furs, silks, tobacco, sugar, wood being transferred into England. And then from from the western portions of Africa, you have gold, ivory, spices, and even slaves being transferred over into the Americas. So if you can just look at this map here, and you can see one of the shapes that it makes is a triangle. So that's why for many people they call this the triangular slave trade. The triangular trade. Manufactured goods in exchange for slaves, in exchange for raw materials to be turned into manufactured goods, in exchange for slaves, in exchange for raw materials. This sort of word here down at the bottom, the middle passage, the distance between Africa over to the Americas was called the Middle Passage, right? So that's what this means. And so people often use terms like the Middle Passage or the Black Atlantic as means for sort of understanding what would happen to slaves as they transverse through that, and we'll talk about that just shortly. So this map will tell you that the large majority of slaves that were brought to the Americas, largely from Africa, the majority of them went to places like Brazil, and only about 4% of the slaves went to actually British North America, and about, let's say, 40%, 40 or 2% more of the slaves went into the Caribbean. So the highest percentage of places where slaves were brought to were Brazil and the Caribbean. Fewer slaves were brought to Mexico and Central America and North America. Although you could argue that literally the slaves that were brought to North America had more of an impact, per se, than the slaves that were brought to, let's say, the Caribbean or to Brazil, because America would eventually, through the process of slavery, become the world's wealthiest nation. Now, what we can do is begin to look at how this hegemonic process actually works in real time in terms of slavery. Here is Africa, and I want you to look at the west coast of Africa towards the north, and you have a large country there called Mauritania. If you look directly to the south of Mauritania, you'll see a country called Senegal. Now, I'm using Senegal specifically for purposes. One is because I've been to this country and I know a little bit about its role in the slave trade, but it helps for me to kind of explain how this process of hegemony would essentially work in terms of slavery. So here is Senegal, and if you look closely, you'll see towards the north a star, and it has Dakar. Right off the coast of Dakar is an island called Gorée. This island is quite small, but it had such a fundamental role to play in slavery. This island was a way station for slaves that were captured off the coast of Africa. They were brought to this island for what we call the acculturation process, to prepare slaves for movement from Africa over to the New World. Now, you have to kind of think about it from this particular aspect. When you capture slaves, many of the people that you captured might be people that were in the military. They might be individuals who are sick, who might be an overall threat to the ship's crew. You need to process the slaves. You want to count their numbers, divide them up. You need to begin an overall process of transforming people who are Africans into slaves. And this process must begin somewhere. So the thought process by Europeans was to establish some way station where they could begin to process these slaves. And one of the places that they picked was Gorée Island. There were other places in Africa like Elmina that also served, but this is the one that I'm most familiar with simply because I've actually been here. And this is a photograph that I took from a ferry that was coming in to land. And this is, as you can see, a fort. So as the ships were coming into the port to park, if someone was trying to invade the island from the best possible location, there were cannons. If you can see right up the top of this building, there were cannons situated. Here is one of the cells that the slaves were packed into. Here is another cell where the slaves were packed into, and of course, tiny, cramped conditions, no windows. The cells measured about 9 by 9, and they could contain about 15 to 20 people packed in, mostly held in chains around their arms. So really what's happening is that they've got to subdue the slaves, right, and begin this process. Typically, the slaves were released to go to the bathroom once a day, and there were always demonstrably unsanitary conditions within these the cages or the cells. There were numerous uh, rodent and bug infestations on the islands, and so the islands had to be cleared from time to time and burned and rebuilt. Now, this acculturation process often includes branding. So the slaves might have been bought for a particular plantation, and that plantation would have all of its slaves branded according to its insignia. Each of the slaves were given new names, Christian names. Depending upon if they were English, they would be given English names, Portuguese names, Spanish names, etc. And then after an incubation period, which usually lasts somewhere between 1 to 2 weeks, the slaves would have been walked out this door onto a gangplank out to a ship. And then from the ship, the slaves would have been packed in. And so the slaves, as you can see, would have been packed in on multiple levels and crammed into the ship for the couple of weeks' journey over to the Americas. And that's why they call this the Middle Passage. Once the slaves were put aboard this ship, and after a few days, the slaves would generally recognize that there was no turning back, that this was it, that they had been captured into slavery and befallen a fate that, generally speaking, there was no way out of it. Now, once these slaves were packed in, they were packed in tightly. They called this tight packing. So a slave would have been packed from head to toe, naked. The slaves generally were not allowed to go to the bathroom anywhere except exactly where they laid. So the slaves would have to lay in their own feces and urine for the whole trip. People would remark that you could smell a slave ship days before it actually arrived to its final destination. At times, those slaves who either were unruly or they died were basically tossed overboard. In some rare cases, but infamous cases, slaves were actually thrown overboard alive. There was a really famous case called the Somerset case in England, where the entire cargo of slaves were basically thrown overboard alive, simply so the ship could reap the profit from the insurance money, right? And that's what would help turn the tide for the English to begin to get rid of slavery. Children essentially were placed on deck of the ships because putting children down into the bowels of the ship was seen as too deadly. Advertisements would be made in newspapers about the impending arrival of ships, and that anybody who could read and had money could read the advertisement for slaves, and they could actually go to the slave markets where the ships would land and just buy slaves. Those slaves would then make their way to their plantations and been forced to work doing all kinds of activities. The slaves were, of course, treated cruelly. This is a mask that slaves were made to wear as punishment. So here the slaves were not able to drink or eat for days. The metal bar that you see that's on the neck of the slaves was meant to keep the slaves from literally laying down and getting adequate rest. Whippings, brandings, mutilations were all customary for slaves. The accommodations were for slaves were, of course, poor. They lived in mud houses. Oftentimes, slaves had to build their own houses, but we'll talk about that as we progress through and look at antebellum slavery a little bit further. But you should now have some estimation about slavery and how it worked in the Americas for the British. Indentured servitude begins as a form of labor system that essentially ends, and then slave labor is essentially used to supplant indentured servitude. And then we begin to see with that the transformation of British America into a society with slaves, into at least some portions of it as being a slave society. Okay, that about wraps it up. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me.